Ladies and gentlemen, there is a phenomenon in human behavior that is so subtle, so quietly woven into the architecture of the mind, that most people will live their entire lives without fully noticing it. Yet it shapes the choices we make, the paths we follow, the risks we take, and even the destinies we resist. I've spent decades studying the neuroscience of attachment, motivation, and the invisible drivers behind great achievement. And throughout that work, one truth keeps resurfacing: every remarkable mind, no matter how powerful, carries within it a bond so deep, so intrinsic, that it becomes almost impossible to escape. This bond is not one of convenience or circumstance. It is not born out of fame, wealth, or external validation. It precedes all of that. It is older than ambition and stronger than logic. This is the bond that forms when a person's internal world attaches itself to a mission, a person, or a meaning so profoundly that the attachment becomes a biological signature, a pattern etched into the neural circuitry, influencing everything that follows. When studying high-performing individuals, the kind who tear down boundaries, reimagine industries, or push humanity toward futures others barely dare to describe, you begin to notice the same pattern again and again. There is always something or someone acting as the gravitational center of their psyche, something that anchors them when the world is too loud and pulls them forward when fear would prefer to drag them back, something they try to outrun, only to find that the farther they go, the more tightly it follows. This is what I call the inescapable bond. It isn't always romantic, it isn't always familial, and it certainly isn't always comfortable. Sometimes it is a source of strength, sometimes it is a source of pain, but always it is a source of truth, a truth that shapes the stories these individuals live. I've observed this bond in countless innovators and leaders over the years. But there is one example that illustrates this phenomenon with exceptional clarity. A man whose life often appears to be a constant push forward, forward into technology, forward into risk, forward into the unknown. Someone who builds with relentless intensity, disrupts with unblinking conviction, and thinks in trajectories that stretch beyond the predictable boundaries of human thought. You would assume, observing such a person from the outside, that their motivation comes from ambition alone, from a desire for impact, from a drive for innovation, from the thrill of problem solving. But the deeper I've studied cases like this, the more I've realized that even the most visionary minds operate from something profoundly human, something emotional, something vulnerable. And in this case, there exists a bond that has quietly shaped decisions, resilience, and the capacity to endure a level of pressure that would break almost anyone else. This bond is not the headline, grabbing type people speculate about. It is something far more primal, rooted in the neurological patterns formed early in life, when the brain is still learning how to love, how to fear, how to attach, and how to survive. Neuroscientifically, we know that the brain does not simply grow up. It carries its stories with it. Every attachment, every heartbreak, every trust, every loss, every deep connection wires itself into the prefrontal cortex, the amygdala, the insula, the hippocampus. These networks store the emotional blueprints that guide us long after childhood ends. They dictate how we respond to stress, how we seek comfort, how we choose partners, how we tolerate risk. They even influence how we interpret the meaning of our own lives. Now, what fascinates me most is how these early emotional imprints sometimes create a bond with a person or purpose that becomes extraordinarily difficult to break, even when someone tries, even when logic says they should, even when circumstances shift. Because the bond is not held by the mind alone, it is held by the nervous system. And the nervous system does not negotiate. I've seen this play out in the life of the individual I referred to earlier. A person who has often appeared untethered, always moving, always accelerating, but in the neurological sense there has always been a tether, a bond that, despite distance or conflict or transformation, never truly dissolves, one that continues to influence emotional endurance, creative momentum, and even the ability to tolerate loneliness in the pursuit of high-stakes work. This bond isn't defined by spectacle or public narrative. Quite the opposite. Its power comes from its silence, from the way it quietly undergirds an otherwise volatile, high-pressure existence, from the way it stabilizes the emotional system exactly when the world is demanding the impossible, from the way it pulls him back to a sense of meaning when ambition alone can no longer provide it. When people look at great innovators, they tend to focus on the surface, the achievements, the failures, the controversies, the extraordinary leaps of engineering or business or imagination. But if you want to understand what truly drives a person like this, you cannot start from the outside. You must begin within the neural and emotional architecture itself. You must understand the bond. And to understand that bond, you must understand one of the most important scientific truths about human behavior, that a brain wired for extraordinary output is almost always wired for extraordinary attachment. The same neural sensitivity that fuels creativity and vision also magnifies emotional intensity. The same capacity for deep focus also creates a capacity for deep connection. The same relentless pursuit of the impossible often comes from the same system that relentlessly holds on to the people or experiences that once made the individual feel truly seen. That is what makes this bond so difficult to escape, not because of sentimentality, not because of nostalgia, but because the nervous system remembers, because the emotional brain does not erase what was once essential for survival, for identity, or for meaning. And so, even when circumstances change, even when life becomes complex, even when distance grows, the bond remains alive within the patterns of the brain. What's remarkable is that this bond often becomes the silent force behind resilience. When the world is heavy, when stress threatens to overwhelm the autonomic system, when public pressure escalates beyond what the human psyche was evolutionarily designed to handle, it is the memory of connection, the emotional imprint of a person who once mattered deeply, that regulates the nervous system. It stabilizes the heart rate, lowers cortisol, increases dopamine, restores motivation. Even if the person is no longer physically present, even if the relationship has changed form, even if the world never sees it, because the bond is not a social fact, it is a biological one. Many assume that someone operating at the edge of human capability becomes emotionally detached, that they must sacrifice connection for progress. But the human brain doesn't allow that. In fact, the greater the stress, the stronger the need for an anchoring presence. Sometimes that presence is real. Sometimes it is remembered. Sometimes it is imagined. Sometimes it is the echo of a connection that once shaped their emotional landscape so strongly that its influence still lingers decades later. What matters is not the form. What matters is the function: emotional regulation, psychological grounding, motivational stability. This is where the story becomes truly fascinating. Because even when someone appears unstoppable, even when they build rockets, electric systems, global infrastructures, new industries, their progress is not fueled by isolation. It is fueled by the invisible emotional circuitry that holds them together. And at the center of that circuitry is always the same thing: a bond they cannot escape. Because even when someone appears unstoppable, even when they build rockets, electric systems, global infrastructures, new industries, their progress is not fueled by isolation. It is fueled by the invisible emotional circuitry that holds them together. And at the center of that circuitry is always the same thing: a bond they cannot escape. What's extraordinary is how this bond evolves over time. In the early years, it operates more like gravity, pulling the mind towards certain people, certain feelings, certain memories. And that gravity can be overwhelming. It can dictate choices. It can influence relationships. It can shape how a person responds to moments of loss or triumph. But as the individual matures, something fascinating happens. The bond stops being just an anchor and becomes a compass. It begins to guide the direction of growth. I've witnessed this transformation countless times in the lives of the world's most consequential thinkers. A bond that once created emotional vulnerability eventually becomes the very thing that gives them clarity. It sharpens their intuition. It strengthens their resilience. It protects their creativity. And in moments when life feels unbearably heavy, it gives them a reason, not to keep going, but to keep becoming. In the case of the individual whose life we've been observing, you can see this transformation with remarkable clarity. Although the world focuses on his ventures, the rockets, the neural interfaces, the sprawling networks of innovation, the true story lies beneath the visible surface. It lies in the emotional evolution that has taken place across the decades. The bond that once felt like an echo from the past has quietly evolved into something much more powerful, a stabilizing force in an unpredictable world. Neuroscience knows this process well. We call it emotional integration, when the brain takes an attachment that once existed in one form and reorganizes it into a deeper internal resource. When this happens, the bond doesn't weaken. It doesn't fade. It becomes more refined, more deliberate, more reflective. Instead of acting from instinct, the individual begins acting from understanding. Instead of being pulled unconsciously, they begin moving consciously. The bond becomes less about longing and more about alignment. It is at this stage, and only at this stage, that the remarkable happens. The individual's mind achieves a state of coherence. Coherence is one of the most powerful psychological states a human can experience. It is the moment when logic and emotion, memory and motivation, fear and purpose, all begin working in harmony. And for someone carrying an inescapable emotional bond, coherence does something extraordinary. It channels that bond into brilliance. This is why some of the greatest innovations in history happen, not during moments of peace, but during moments of emotional transformation. Because transformation reorganizes the emotional brain. It frees up cognitive bandwidth. It converts old pain into new creativity. It turns attachment into fuel. In this case, the bond became the engine behind a new era of risk-taking, a new era of empathy, a new era of vision. It became the silent motivator behind decisions others labeled bold, reckless, impossible. But the neuroscientific truth is far simpler. A regulated emotional system produces clearer logic. A grounded nervous system produces better judgment. A sense of internal connection produces stronger courage. This is why I've always said, if you want to understand the trajectory of a visionary, you must understand not their intellect, but their emotional history. The most profound truth of all is this: human greatness is never purely cognitive. It is always emotional. We often talk about intelligence as if it exists in isolation, as if ideas come from the prefrontal cortex alone, divorced from the rise and fall of the human heart. But cognition doesn't work that way. Creativity doesn't work that way. Resilience doesn't work that way. The neural networks responsible for innovation are deeply intertwined with the networks responsible for connection. This is why some of the most extraordinary breakthroughs in history have come from people who carried extraordinary emotional stories. And it is why, in the life of the person we've been discussing, the bond has played such an essential role. Even during moments when the world demanded superhuman levels of composure, even during moments when pressure threatened to fracture the psychological system, even during moments when public perception, loneliness, exhaustion, and unrelenting responsibility came crashing down at once. Through it all, the bond operated like a hidden stabilizer, reorganizing the brain's emotional system, keeping motivation alive, maintaining psychological elasticity. Without such a bond, the nervous system becomes brittle, stress accumulates, creativity collapses, decision-making deteriorates. But with such a bond, the mind becomes capable of enduring nearly anything. What fascinates me most is that this bond was not chosen. It was not strategized. It was not engineered. It emerged organically from a moment of connection strong enough to leave a permanent emotional imprint. And like all permanent imprints, it became encoded into the structure of memory, not as a narrative, but as a regulatory mechanism. This is why the bond could not be escaped, because it wasn't external, it was internal. It lived not in circumstance, but in neurobiology, not in presence, but in perception, not in story, but in structure. Understanding this reveals a truth most people never learn. When a bond is built deeply enough, it doesn't live in the relationship, it lives in the nervous system. And the nervous system does not reset simply because life moves forward. What changes over time is what the bond means to the individual. At first it might mean longing, later it might mean loss, but eventually, if the individual grows, it becomes wisdom. And that is the point few people ever reach. This is the moment when the individual no longer tries to outrun the bond, or suppress it, or reinterpret it, or replace it. Instead, they integrate it, allowing it to become a stabilizing part of the self. And once this happens, the bond transforms from a source of emotional turbulence into a source of emotional depth. It expands the capacity for empathy. It sharpens intuition. It strengthens leadership. It deepens purpose. In the person we've examined today, that transformation is evident in every new chapter of their life. You can see it in how they manage stress more efficiently than they once did. You can see it in how their creativity has become more expansive, more human, more courageous. You can see it in how their decisions, even when bold, now carry a kind of grounded clarity they lacked years before. This is the invisible evolution the public misses entirely. People see the outcomes. They see the products. They see the industries being reshaped. But they never see the emotional growth that makes such evolution possible. They never see the bond that continues to guide, to regulate, to inspire. They never see the emotional architecture behind the innovation. But if you look closely, if you understand the neuroscience, it becomes obvious. Because the emotional architecture of a visionary is always visible in their patterns, if you know where to look. You see it in the kinds of risks they take, in the kinds of people they trust, in the moments when they hesitate, and in the moments when they leap without hesitation at all. You see it in the way they respond to conflict, not only externally, but internally. You see it in the way their brain handles uncertainty, and in the way their nervous system prepares for challenge. And above all, you see it in the way they keep returning, again and again, to a single emotional reference point. Even if that reference lives only in memory, even if it is not consciously acknowledged, even if it is buried beneath 1,000 layers of responsibility, fatigue, and public expectation. Because that reference point is not a choice. It is a foundation. There is a misconception that deeply attached individuals are somehow less independent, less disciplined, or less capable of great ambition. But this is a misunderstanding of how the human mind works. The truth is that attachment and independence are not opposites. They are inseparable forces. A person becomes capable of great independence only when they have once experienced the kind of attachment that regulates their nervous system. Without it, independence becomes instability. With it, independence becomes strength. And for the individual we followed today, that early emotional imprint, that bond, created a kind of neurological scaffolding. It allowed the mind to endure solitude when necessary. It allowed the imagination to venture into territories that most people would find terrifying. It allowed the individual to push boundaries with an intensity that would overwhelm an unentered psyche. But here is the extraordinary thing. Even as the bond provided stability, it also provided vulnerability, and that vulnerability matters. Because vulnerability is where authenticity comes from. It is where empathy grows. It is where creativity becomes human rather than mechanical. It is where vision becomes purpose. What I find most compelling is how moments of deep emotional connection leave long-lasting neural signatures. When a bond forms at a profound level, the amygdala and hippocampus learn its shape, its emotional contour, and they continue responding to that contour even decades later. It becomes part of the individual's emotional operating system. Think about that for a moment. An entire lifetime of decisions can be influenced by a bond that formed long ago. A bond that may no longer exist in any visible form, yet continues to define how the nervous system interprets safety, motivation, and meaning. For the person in our case study, this is precisely what has happened. The bond became a silent partner in every moment of innovation. Not because it dictated choices, but because it shaped the emotional climate in which those choices were made. This is the hidden dimension people misunderstand about extraordinary individuals. They assume great ambition rises from logic. They assume great courage rises from discipline. They assume great creativity rises from intelligence. But in truth, the emotional brain is the engine. The intellectual brain is merely the steering system. The emotional brain determines whether a person collapses under pressure or rises through it, whether they lose motivation or find new strength in adversity, whether they retreat from risk or walk directly into it with clarity. And when a person carries an inescapable bond, a bond integrated deeply into their emotional architecture, that bond becomes a reservoir of psychological energy. It becomes the place the mind returns to when the world becomes too heavy. It becomes the breath before the breakthrough. It becomes the calm before the launch. It becomes the memory that reminds the nervous system, you are not alone, keep going. And that, perhaps more than any technical skill, is what sustains the great visionaries of the world. But there is another dimension, one even more subtle, yet profoundly powerful. The bond also shapes how a visionary sees the future. Humans don't imagine futures out of thin air. We imagine futures from the emotional material we carry inside us. This is why two people can look at the exact same challenge and envision completely different possibilities. One sees fear, the other sees opportunity. One sees limitation, the other sees potential. One sees chaos, the other sees a frontier waiting to be explored. The difference lies not in intellect, but in emotional architecture. And when an individual carries a bond that once represented a sense of safety, connection, or meaning, that bond becomes the material from which they build their vision of the future. It becomes the emotional blueprint behind the technological blueprint. It becomes the shape of their hope. In the case of our subject, you can see this in the way every major innovation aligns with one underlying theme: the desire to protect, to elevate, to secure, to ensure continuity, not just for themselves, but for humanity. This is not accidental, it is emotional, it is biological. It is the bond speaking through the vision. What makes this even more remarkable is that the individual does not have to consciously recognize this influence for it to operate. The emotional brain works beneath awareness. It shapes intuition. It influences instinct. It colors perception. And often it reveals itself only in hindsight, if at all. But for those of us who study the mind closely, the pattern is unmistakable. And as the years go on, something even more fascinating happens. The bond that once stabilized the individual begins to shape their legacy. It influences not only how they think, but why they think. Not only what they build, but what they hope those creations will mean. Not only the problems they solve, but the future they imagine solving them for. And as the emotional brain continues to evolve, the bond becomes something new, something larger than the individual themselves. It becomes a guiding force, a quiet teacher, a source of meaning that transcends achievement. And in the final evolution of this bond, something extraordinary occurs. The individual stops trying to escape it, and instead begins to honor it. They begin to recognize that their greatest breakthroughs were not born from isolation, but from the emotional architecture that once held them together during their most vulnerable years. They begin to see that the bond was never a weakness. It was the hidden strength that made everything possible. And in that moment, something remarkable happens internally. The mind settles, the nervous system balances, the emotional brain finds peace, and the person, perhaps for the first time, understands themselves fully. This is the transformation we rarely witness, yet it is one of the most profound changes a human being can experience. It is what makes their later achievements more thoughtful, more grounded, more emotionally sophisticated. It is what allows them to lead not only with intelligence, but with depth. It is what allows greatness to become wisdom. And it is here, in this final stage, that the bond reaches its full flowering, not as a tether, not as a longing, not as a shadow, but as a source of clarity. A quiet pulse beneath the chaos of a busy life. A steady rhythm beneath the noise of the world. a reminder of what matters, a reminder of where they came from, a reminder of why they continue to rise. And it is that, more than any invention, any technology, any revolution, that defines the truest legacy of a visionary mind. Because in the end, what drives us forward is never the machinery we build. It is the emotional truth we carry. It is the bond we cannot escape, because it is the bond that made us who we are. And in the deepest moments of clarity, the individual realizes that escaping it was never the goal. The goal was understanding it, integrating it, growing with it, and ultimately, allowing it to become the heartbeat of a life lived with purpose.